Hello. So this is it. This is my final and last video. Of 2023, of course. I'm not going anywhere, so stick around. I wouldn't call myself a hoarder, but I would admit that I sometimes have a hard time throwing things away. And over the last year I've accumulated a fair amount of pieces of leftover XPS foam. So I thought instead of throwing them away, I'd use them to create a rock creature, hanging out in nature and, having a good time. Alright, so the idea is to make some kind of an ancient giant walking through a forest whose body is made up by a bunch of XPS foam rocks. I'll also make a little druid. But first, let's focus on the giant. Let's start by making a head, and this little piece of foam was just what I was looking for. I started by cutting away the excess foam before drawing a general shape of the head. And I repeated this process a couple of times, slowly cutting away smaller and smaller pieces of foam while drawing more details to the face, giving me an idea of what the face eventually would look like. And since I've never carved the face out of foam before, I made sure to take my time and repeatedly check the little sketch that I'd made of how I was envisioning the giant's head. But for some reason, every time I tried to make a face, it always turned out looking like beautiful Squidward. So we'll have to fix that, I guess. I realized the nose I'd made wasn't bulbous enough for my taste, so I carved out a new nose out of a little piece of foam that I gave some texture using my favorite rock before cutting away the old one and gluing the new one onto the face. And just like that, it was already looking much better, but it still needs some ears. So in a similar fashion to the nose, I made a pair of wildly overproportioned ears, because seeing a giant or a troll with small facial features just makes me sad. And when the ears was glued onto the face, I also added a bigger lower lip, as well as giving the head some more details, making it look like the head is comprised of a bunch of smaller rocks. I'm happy about the way the head turned out. It looks a bit like those Easter Island heads, but unlike those ones, our giant is gonna have a body. Well, as it would turn out, my life has been a lie. They have bodies. My bad. Anyways. Alright, as previously mentioned, our giant's body will be made up by a bunch of smaller rocks, perhaps being held together by some magical force flowing through the ancient forest where he wanders, or something like that, I guess. I haven't really thought about the lore of this giant, but if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them in the comments down below. I made sure to give the rocks many different shapes and sizes, but as you might have guessed, I didn't just make 4. Of course I made a few. Then it was just a question of piecing them together, and I found 3 that would be the perfect start to the torso. So then it was just a question of starting to glue the pieces together, one by one. And I have to say, this process was incredibly delightful, perhaps even the most fun I've had crafting in quite a while. So I highly recommend this to anyone, and I will definitely be making more rock creatures using XPS foam in the future. The torso was starting to look quite good, so it was time to add some arms. And at this point I was still winging the pose of the giant and just letting it take me where it wanted to go. And after a few more pieces of foam at the end of the torso, then it was time to add the head to see if we were heading in the right direction, and I have to say that I'm liking the way it looks so far. I came to the conclusion that I wanted the giant to strike that old Captain Morgan pose and have one leg elevated, leaning on some rock or something, while the other leg would just be a normal leg, I guess. Right, looking quite nice, but where are them feet at? I'm sure that any fellow sculptor out there will agree that making hands and feet out of clay can be a bit of a challenge, or perhaps a nightmare is more accurate. But luckily for me, I'm not planning on changing materials just yet, so I made a matching pair of stone walkers that I glued on to the end of the legs. And as I was doing that, I figured it would look cool if the giant would have a walking stick in his right hand, and I just happened to have the perfect twig lying around, looking all bumpy and stumpy, so I decided to make that into the walking stick, or walking log. I attached a small piece of foam that would be the palm of the hand, before adding some fingers that would wrap around the log. And with the fingers done, I added the hand to the arm. I also made the giant's left hand in a quite similar fashion to the feet off camera. And when that had been glued on, then the giant was done. Alright, let's see here now. Time to make the little druid, I guess. So the plan is to make a little druid dude who's wandering out and about in the forest when all of a sudden he sees a towering creature entirely made out of rock and stone, gazing down on him with eyes darker than the ancient forest that surrounds him. Or something like that. And when the druid's armature was safely secured in my sculpting core candle, then it was time to add some aluminum foil. Voila! The body was bulked up with the first initial layer of clay that I covered the entire thing in before moving on to any details. And just like with a lot of my sculptures, I like to start at the bottom and work my way up. So I added some small lumps of clay and shaped them into some boots that's made for walking. And then I added some ragtaggedy ankle warmers above the boots. And to make sure they're not flopping around too much, I secured them with a little clay rope. I poked some folds here and there onto the legs before it was time to add some clothing to the body. And the idea was to make some kind of a long outer jacket thing that I have no idea what it would be called in English. So I added those two pieces of a thin clay clothing on the body before wrapping a belt around the waist, which I gave some rough leather texture, as well as adding a little belt buckle I made off camera. Some clay ropes to hold the clothes together was put into place before it was time to make a robe. I used my opposable thumbs to make some folds on the robe before attaching it to the rest of the body. Then a little flat pancake with a hole in the pancake was added on top of the shoulders before poking it with my sculpting tool to make it look a bit more like fur. And then I finished it off by using my hobby knife to get some extra fine details. And I'm quite happy about the way it turned out. I poked 2 eye holes in the blob of clay more commonly known as the head, before trying in the fiddly-diddliest of manner to sculpt the face that I would actually call a face. And I think it kind of looks like a face. But enough talk about the face, let's talk about the hair. I wanted the druid to have a long braid in the back, so I took 3 clay ropes and I started to braid them to the best of my ability, and it actually turned out like a braid. And when the braid was attached, then I made the transition to the hair look a bit better before adding a clay rope around the head that I poked a bit flatter that would become some kind of a simple crown. And with that in place, the head was done and it was time to make some hands. I added some teeny-weeny clay blobs to the end of the arms that would become the main parts of the hands before adding the tiniest of fingers as well as giving them some additional details. And since the hands turned out too big, I made a responsible decision to cover up half of them with some more clay and let's never talk about it again. Never talk about it again. The ropes wasn't looking scruffy enough for my taste, so I gave it some additional wear and tear so it wouldn't look brand new. And lastly, before the druid was finished, I added a rope necklace with a big rock at the end of it. And with that in place, the sculpting was done and it was time to make a base for our druid and giant to stand on. I measured a 17 by 22 cm rectangle that I cut out from the larger piece of XPS foam. Then I took my plier and started to nibble away pieces all around the sides of the base, because I wanted the sides to be less boring and once it's completed actually feel like it's a part of the forest scenery that will be on top of the base. I took my trusty old blue Bic pen and I drew some squiggly lines to mark out where I wanted to have some rock formations on the base. Using my hot glue gun, I glued down some larger pieces of foam within the markings that I had previously made. One larger piece of foam where the giant would be standing and a smaller one to the left of the druid. And I also added a few extra pieces here and there for good measure. And then it was time to make the rocks look a bit more like rocks and a bit less like XPS foam. I find that using a plier is a quite effective way of making rocks out of XPS foam. But every once in a while the plier won't do the trick, so you need a knife and also a real rock. And I mean, who doesn't love rock? You know, ripping guitar solos, heavy drum grooves, the occasional prepubescent scream from a grown man. What am I talking about? Let's just add some dirt to the base, I guess. I sprinkled on a healthy amount of PVA glue onto the entire base before smearing it like butter on toast, or smöra brödet as we say in Sweden. Then I added the dirt I found out in nature onto the entire base, making sure that I didn't leave any part of the XPS visible. And of course picking up the leftover dirt that fell off the base to use in future projects. Some bigger chunks of dirt was added here and there, just to break up the uniformity a little bit. And then everything was built, sculpted and crafted, and you know what that means? Then it was time to paint. I started by painting the base since we're already fiddling around with it. And to be more precise, I started by painting the rocks in a wide variety, in quotation marks, in different shades of browns and greys. And when the base coat had had proper time to dry, then it was time to make them rocks pop a bit more, if you know what I'm saying. So I grabbed my brush and I started to dry brush some highlights onto every rock on the entire base, as well as the rock formations along the sides. I also painted some orange and greens on the base, as well as giving some of the dirt some additional highlighting. And the base is starting to look good, but it's not done yet. We still have to add some of this stuff over here. I started by adding some yellowy grass tufts in groups of 2 and 3 along the sides of some of the rocks. Then sprinkling on some flock with different shades of green to simulate the look of moss, which I added both on top of the rocks as well as on the ground. And when that was done, then the base was done and it was time to paint our rock giant dude. Alright. Well, my money don't jiggle, but this giant's walking stick surely does. And it kept on jiggling the entire time I was painting him, making me a bit dizzy. Just like with the rocks on the base, the rocks on the giant was painted with different shades of grey and brown to give a more natural feel to it. And just like with the base, I know I've said it before, but when the base coat had dried, then I proceeded by dry brushing some highlights onto every rock, still making sure that the color of the base layer was shining through and not covering it all up. I stippled on some dots with an off-white color on a few of the rocks just to add a little bit more variation. And then the giant was painted, but just like with the base, he still needs some flock. So I added some watered down PVA glue before sprinkling on the same green flock that I'd previously used on the base. And of course, I just couldn't help myself but to give him some really nice green mossy eyebrows. I also gave the twig a little flock, but other than that I kept it all natural. And just like the cherry on top of a cake, I found this little warhammer bird that only had one leg, but I painted it and attached it to the giant's head, because every rock giant needs a little bird friend. And speaking of friend, or foe perhaps, then it was time to paint the Druid. Hey, ho, hey! I wasn't entirely sure how to paint the Druid, but I started to add some muted base colors, and as I tried to lift him from the core candle, of course I managed to give him a crack in the leg. But you know what? That's okay. I proceeded by painting all the other parts of the Druid with their individual base colors to get an idea if my color selection would work. I was going for a quite muted and natural overall look, almost make it look like the clothing could act as camouflage in nature. And when all the base colors were done, then it was time to focus on the details. I started with the face, since faces usually is a quite important part of any model, and even though his back will be more visible in the end, I still felt that I didn't want to neglect the face, but instead try and paint it as good as I could. I mean, otherwise what's the reason of sculpting a face? The robes got painted with thin lines that progressively would get lighter and lighter, and as I was doing that I realized that the foot had broken off. But there's nothing superglue can't fix, as I like to say, so I just glued it back on and everything was great from here on out. And I painted a couple layers of highlights onto the fur while still leaving the recessed areas dark, before moving on to painting the jacket and the belt, which I wanted to look like distressed leather in different stages of distressedness, or whatever it's called. I painted both the arms and the legs with a scruffy old beige color, and speaking of scruffy and old, I wanted the shoes to almost look like they had been walking through mud, so I made them look reasonably dirty. Some additional details was added on the ragtaggedy ankle warmers, and then I painted a rock hanging from the necklace to look like a red gemstone. Lastly, I added some black wash to the metallic parts to give them a bit more depth, and then the Druid was done. Oh boy, what a year 2023 has been. And if you're someone living according to the Gregorian calendar, I would like to wish you a happy new year, and if not, I hope you have a great weekend and I will see you again really soon. Here are the final results. thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. There will be a lot of cool stuff happening in 2024 on this channel, including a collab with Bill making stuff, as well as some other really cool YouTubers. So if you don't want to miss that, please consider subscribing. And yeah, Happy New Year!